What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to episode 17 of Manny's Food Channel. It's your boy Manny, aka Mr. Cooking It Up. And for this episode, my family has been hassling me for a couple weeks now to make this recipe, so I decided to finally get to it, kill two birds with one stone. So for this video, I decided to do a house-made cinnamon buns with my own twist. There's a little bit of cocoa powder and pecans in there as well. I just finished cooking them and the house is perfumed with cinnamon and it smells and tastes absolutely freaking delicious. So let's get right to it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to heat up the milk. We're not going to bring it up to a boil because we don't want to split the fat from the milk. So we're just going to heat it up just until it hits a little bit above body temperature. And then after that, we're going to add in the butter to melt them together before we start making our dough. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to test it out. Just dip my finger in there, make sure it's not too hot. Now I'm going to add in the butter. This is about half a cup of butter. And it's going to be a very rich dough. So that's why I add this much butter in there. And now all we're going to do is I'm going to turn off the stove and let the butter melt. So this step is extremely important because we're going to activate the yeast now. You want to make sure that this butter and milk mixture isn't too hot. If it is too hot, let it cool down for a little bit. And the way to test that is by putting your finger inside this mixture. If it feels a little bit hot to the touch on your finger, then let it cool down a bit. This one doesn't, so we can start to make our dough. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in sugar and mix that in. Like I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a very rich dough, so the sugar helps to add some flavor in there as well. And now we're going to activate the yeast. So I'm just going to toss in about 2.5 teaspoons of yeast. And then we're going to let this sit for around 10 to 15 minutes until the yeast starts to activate. And then we'll move on to add in the flour and start making the dough. Alright, so I've been letting this sit for around 15 minutes and you can tell that the yeast has been activated when it starts to get really bubbly and foamy at the top. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly add in the flour and mix it until it's very well incorporated. And then we're going to set this aside and let it rest for about an hour or so. So that way it can gain in size close to double its size. So I'm just going to mix this in, and it's going to be a little bit of a slack dough, but don't worry about it. Later on we're going to be adding another cup of flour in there as well. Alright, so now that the flour has been well incorporated and mixed in very well, I'm going to be covering this up and I'm going to put it in the oven. I'm not going to turn it on, but I want to leave it in a warm place so that way it can rise. And I'm going to let this rest for probably about an hour or so, or until it doubles in size, and then we'll go on to assemble the cinnamon bun. But in the meantime, we're going to be doing the filling. Okay, so while the dough is rising, we're going to work on the filling. We're going to elevate this filling just a touch. We're not going to do the traditional just cinnamon, butter, and sugar mix. I'm going to add in a touch of crushed pecans, as well as a little bit of cocoa powder to give a bit of a bitter aftertaste to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in all the ingredients little by little. First I'm going to start with the sugar. Now for this recipe, I definitely suggest taking your butter out of the fridge a day before you're about to use it, because you want the butter to be at room temperature so that way it's easily pliable and moldable, and that way you can mix it. But if you do happen to forget it, you can definitely put it in a mixer and then cream it that way. Also, if you don't want to use it by hand, you can use your mixer as well, because this will be tiring on your shoulders and your hand. But now that I incorporated the sugar, next up I'm going to add in the cinnamon. Now I'm doing this one step at a time so that way I can make sure that all the ingredients are well incorporated before I add the next one. So now I've incorporated the cinnamon. I swapped to using a spatula now because the butter is very pliable and easier to mix now instead of fluffing with a fork. So next up I'm going to add the cocoa flour. Now be careful it doesn't splash back at you when you begin to mix it, so just very gently incorporate it. Alright, and finally I'm going to add in the chopped pecans. Just that way it gives a bit of a different texture and flavor in the cinnamon bun. So I'm going to continue to mix this. It's going to have a nice chocolatey and cinnamony flavor. I'm going to mix this for another 30 seconds until it's well incorporated. Then I'm going to take my dough out, which once you see it, it's been more than doubled in size. And we can start assembling the cinnamon bun. Okay, before we continue on with the dough, I'm just going to prepare the baking pan that I'm going to use. So I'm just going to butter it up on all sides of the surface, so that way it doesn't stick to the bottom and it has a nice caramelization at the bottom. We want to make sure everything's prepared before we cut the dough because we don't want to leave it out too long so that way it dries. So I'm just going to quickly butter up both of my baking pans. Alright, so the dough has been resting for about an hour and 15 minutes from my side. As you can see, it completely blown up. It's gotten even bigger than double the size. And it's got a nice airy texture. So now we're going to finish off the dough. First, what we're going to do is we're going to sprinkle on a cup of flour. Don't worry about deflating it because ultimately we're going to deflate all the bubbles in here. So first we're going to add a cup of flour. Next up I'm going to add a touch of baking powder because we're going to let it sit to rise again after we add in the filling in the cinnamon bun. And then finally I'm going to add in just a touch of salt. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slowly mix this in, try not making too much mess, and incorporate all the flour, and then we can start kneading the dough. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start kneading the dough. Add flour as you need to, don't add excess because you don't want it to be a thick dough, you want it to be a very light and fluffy dough. So now I'm going to do is I'm going to knead this for probably 4 to 5 minutes. Just bring it in and knead it with the palm so that way you can start forming a dough. And don't add any excess flour unless you need to. At this point mine is not sticking, so I'm not going to add any flour, but if I feel the need to add more then I definitely will. So knead this for 4 to 5 minutes until the dough starts to form, then we can start shaping it out. So one way to check if you have a good dough or not is press it and see if it bounces back. If it starts to bounce back, then you have a good dough. If you don't, it's definitely okay. Just continue to use it, but it just means that it might be a little bit thicker or a little bit more dense than you'd like it to be. So just press it. If it starts to bounce back, which it is right now, that means you have a good dough. So now we're going to move on to shaping the dough. I've kneaded this for around 5 minutes. So I'm not going to flour my surface, I'm just going to use any excess flour that I have on the table here. I don't want it to stick too much to the surface, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to shape it out kind of to the shape that I want it to, which will be a rectangle, and then we're going to roll it in. Alright, so now I'm ready to roll out the dough. I got a rolling pin here, I got just any excess flour that I have from the bowl, I'm just going to continue to use it. So I'm going to flour up my rolling pin here. And I have a bench scraper. The bench scraper is going to help me to kind of shape and mold at the very end. make sure that it's an even rectangle. So now I'm just going to start rolling it out little by little.
That you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
So now I've rolled out the dough. I'm just going to use the offset spatula to kind of square it off all the sides. Don't worry about it too much if it's not completely even, because we're going to roll it out and cut it anyways. So we're just going to square it up just a touch, and then we're going to start adding the filling. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute the filling. So I'm just going to use an offset spatula, and I'm not going to put it in one place, I'm going to separate it. And then we're going to use the offset spatula to slowly, evenly spread out all the filling. Make sure you evenly distribute it. If there's a part of the cinnamon roll that doesn't have filling, I'm sure your guests won't be too happy about that. And you want to share all this goodness evenly amongst every single cinnamon roll. So now that this has been evenly distributed, the filling has been evenly distributed. At this point, if you want to add any other toppings, you definitely can. For the sake of this recipe, because my family really likes cinnamon, I'm going to go a little bit overboard with the cinnamon, so I'm going to add more cinnamon in there. But this will be the step if you want to add any other ingredients such as chocolate chips or different kind of nuts, you can definitely add it in there. So I'm just going to add a touch. Now what I'm going to do is make sure your hands are dry and you don't have any other toppings or ingredients on your hands. And now we're going to roll it from your side closest to you all the way to the other side. And just do it very slowly. You don't have to be very quick at this step. You want to make sure that it's evenly rolled out. But at the same time, you want to make sure that it's all tightly rolled. So start from one edge and finish at the other. And make sure it's nicely and tightly rolled. And then we can start cutting it. And we'll put it to rest before we start cutting.
I don't deny there's some strange evolutionary process going on, but mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence.
Okay, so once you're finished rolling your cinnamon bun, at this step we're going to start cutting it. Now, some people would like to use a knife, or they can use this as well, but to show you guys a little secret, I use dental floss. Now, that might sound weird, but the great thing about dental floss is you're going to get evenly sliced cuts every single time, rather than sometimes when you use a knife it pushes through the dough. So what we're going to do is, I'll start from this side, figure out what thickness you'd like of your dough. So I'm probably going to say around 1 inch, and then all I'm going to do is just pull, and then we're going to get a nicely even cut cinnamon roll. Now I'm going to put this on my buttered molds here, or my baking pan, and because we're going to let it rest, I'm probably going to do maybe 8 per pan, and I have another pan that I greased up with butter as well. So I'm going to continue to do this, and then I'm going to let it rest for 45 minutes, wrap it up, and just leave it at room temperature so that way it continues to rise, and then we're going to put it in the oven. Okay, so I'm going to let the cinnamon bun rest for around 45 minutes. just so it can continue to proof and continue to rise. So while we're waiting for that, we're going to make the delicious cream cheese glaze. So what I'm going to do here is, if you want to use a mixer, you can definitely do that. But if you take the cream cheese out and it hits room temperature, then you can do this by hand, this step by hand. So first what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cream the cream cheese just until it's very smooth. And the only ingredients I'm going to be adding is butter, milk, a little bit of vanilla extract, and some powdered sugar. So the reason why we're using powdered sugar instead of the granulated sugar is because we want the glaze to be very smooth, and we don't want those little bit of chunks inside. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly incorporate every single ingredient. I'm going to start off by adding the milk. Once that's incorporated, then I'm going to add the butter, then the vanilla, and then finally the powdered sugar.
But mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
Alright, so I've been whisking this for a couple minutes. I've removed any of the lumps that are from the cream cheese. So it's very smooth texture now and it's very well incorporated. I'm going to start adding in the powdered sugar, but I'm only going to do it in batches. I'm not going to add them in all at once because I want to make sure that every time I add in the powdered sugar, I remove any of the lumps so that this stays a very nice consistency and it's very smooth. So add the powdered sugar in bunches or in different batches, little by little incorporate it, and make sure that all the lumps are removed before you add in the next batch, so that way it continues to stay very smooth. Alright, so I've been letting this proof for about 45 minutes or so, and look how picture perfect this looks. It looks absolutely delicious, and we haven't even baked them off yet. I've let it proof for around 45 minutes. Now I'm going to cook them off in the oven at 350 degrees for about 25 to 30 minutes, or until it's fully cooked or golden brown at the top. But before I pop them in the oven, I'm just going to brush them off with some butter, so that way we can have that nice char and that golden crust at the top. And then I'm going to pop these in the oven. So the cinnamon buns have been baking for around 25 minutes. I'm just going to open them up quickly and see how they're doing. I'm probably going to pop them in, turn them around and pop them in for another 5 minutes, just so the other side has a bit of color in there as well. But it's looking pretty good. And once this is ready, then we're going to let it rest.
The fact that you and I are working is evidence of that.
So I just took the cinnamon buns out of the oven, and they smell freaking divine. They smell so delicious. But I'm gonna let them rest for around 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, just so when I pour the glaze on, it doesn't pour over and melt the glaze. We want the glaze to stick on top, so I'm gonna let it rest for at least 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're gonna put on the glaze. Before I destroy this beast of a cinnamon bun, I just want you guys to see how light and fluffy this is. I'm barely running my fork through this. The bottom has a nice crust, and the middle is very light and fluffy. You can see how airy it is. Those little light little bubbles there. Now I'm gonna take a huge bite out of this with a bit of glaze and see how it is. And the time has arrived, the taste test. Cheers. Don't be surprised if I told you that after I turn this video off, I would sit down and devour all 4 of these cinnamon buns, because I definitely could. It's freaking delicious. The dough is very light and airy, and the glaze isn't very sweet. And it's complemented a bit by the cocoa powder and the bitterness of it as well. So definitely have a try and let me know how it is. Stay tuned for a video next week actually. I have a request coming all the way from Trinidad. So I'm going to be working on a recipe to bring to you guys next week. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time.